Now we are entering into the keynote session, and I plan to invite two natural scientists, Tom Crowther and also Bob Bartson. However, we are still hunting for Bob somewhere in the United States, so that maybe we should start with Tom, then followed by the Dominic. But let me just say a few words about why we want to have this forum today at this moment. 2 weeks ago that we were in New York, maybe some of you were also in New York, and you can imagine it was a microcosm overwhelmed by geopolitics, geoeconomics, confusion, chaos, disruption, and kind of frustration. But one thing which really sticks to my mind, is a very clear message from science. The science is getting clearer and louder. And that particularly during the week of New York Climate Week, Johan Rockström, who is the Gonokami Sensei already referred to his presentation last year, also made another latest announcement that according to him, we have already transgressed 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries, which suggest that we were totally out of balance with the natural system. It also suggests that we need to really find a way to total, radical, comprehensive transformation of our economy and society if we were to live the prosperous future for generations to come. And actually, this forum, Global Commons Forum, is a space to really identify what can we do to find that pathway. And I have to also say, this is a stable, resilient planet system. We call it the Global Commons, and this Global Commons Center is named after that concept. And it's very clear that we need a total system collaboration, and President Gonokami also mentioned it needs an integration of the science, the transboundary science, but also with business and the policy making and real world. So while we are still hunting for Bob Watson, we would like to ask Tom to come to the stage, and Tom Crowther, the professor and the founder of the Restor. And I understand that you are very much behind this last year's EU restoration law, which is a very significant movement, particularly given this very politically charged moment. So Tom, please come to the stage.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. It's a real honor. I'm going to start with an interesting fact that maybe many of you don't know. Here we go. Did you know that the tin can was invented in 1810? Guess it's not that interesting a fact until you realize this was invented almost half a century later. Sometimes it takes quite a while for our best innovations to take root. These innovations are misunderstood in their time, but we don't have that kind of time when it comes to this, our natural environment. Would it be possible to put the sound on for these slides? Because what we're seeing here is the system that has sustained us since the dawn of our evolution. These are the ecosystems that have provided everything we've ever needed, and yet, right now, the sounds of nature are fading, and they're instead being replaced by these degraded ecosystems. This is not just a climate change problem or a biodiversity problem, this is a humanitarian problem. Because there is no location on the planet where a degraded ecosystem is more valuable than a thriving one. And it's for that reason that nature conservation, protection, and restoration hold such incredible promise for our society. But only if we can overcome the risks along the way. I was recently involved in an innovation that was misunderstood in its time. Back at the beginning of the big data revolution, about 8 or so years ago, we were pulling together insights to understand the state of biodiversity across our planet. Pulling insights from experts all across the globe, we started with this, the global forest system. This magnificent system, we realized, is home to just over 3 trillion trees. It's a staggering scale of a system. And this obviously is very useful to understand this context. We were criticized immediately for missing the trees in the Vatican City, but don't worry, we have updated the numbers and everything's all correct and fine. But this new model helps us to understand, how we can manage the scale of this system effectively. Because it also helped us to realize that we've halved the scale of this global forest system since the dawn of our civilization. But outside of urban and agricultural areas, this model also revealed a massive land of opportunity. About a third of our forested land, of the land that was once forested, is actually in a degraded state, not used extensively by human habitation, but because of past land use, it's in a degraded state where there are no longer forests. And this third of that land surface is about room for about a trillion new trees. And these forests, if they were able to mature into full maturity, could capture just over 200 billion tons of carbon. That's about a third of the carbon third of the carbon we need for our carbon drawdown goals. And it was this carbon number that really put this study on the map. Suddenly it was headlines all over the world. It was absolute chaos. But it gave rise to some wonderful things. It launched the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, in which we still exist now. It was followed up by the WWF Trillion Tree Campaign, and then another Trillion Tree Campaign from the World Economic Forum. And when the President of the United States starts planting trees on the White House lawn, you think this has to be too good to be true. And of course, that's exactly what it was. Because unfortunately, many people also saw this as an opportunity to greenwash, to just plant rows of carbon capturing trees grown as farms at the expense of everything in their wake. This was obviously very bad for the climate change movement because it was greenwashing, but it was terrible for the biodiversity movement itself because these blankets just grow at the expense of the natural species. And it gave rise to a period of academic controversy that really undermined the environmental movement. There was scientists arguing that nature comes at the expense of commitments to our fossil fuel reduction and things like that. And it was a particularly dark time for me personally. I was criticized by some of the scientists I respect most in this world who said, that our numbers were wrong, that I was an armchair ecologist, and more creative insults along the way. And soon this gave rise to headlines that followed suit, instead of focusing on the immense power of nature to help us, they were focusing on the risks of restoration done wrong. And of course, I hope that everyone here in this room and everyone beyond knows that the wrong tree in the wrong place will undoubtedly do more harm than good. It's also worth noting that that is the case for everything that has ever existed. If you stick a toothbrush in the wrong place, you'll do more harm than good. We can't be over-engineering our ecosystems. This is about making a world where nature can thrive for the well-being of all of us. But rather than fighting back against headlines like this, we realized that it was better instead to take a step back and to build consensus. With hundreds and hundreds of ecologists on both sides of the argument, we went back to revisit these numbers, this time with millions of data points from forest plots across the entire globe. And it built us a new, more comprehensive understanding of carbon storage on our planet, both now and its potential state. And this combination of satellite and ground-sourced insights showed us that in 2019, we hadn't actually been overestimating the potential. We'd been underestimating the staggering potential of our ecosystems. But this time, we could highlight how that could be captured. Because the power of nature is in its complexity, where every species depends on other species to survive. So that you cannot be achieving this with vast monocultures, because a complex, healthy ecosystem will always capture, on average, over 50% more carbon than those monocultures do. And that doesn't speak for all the resilience and biodiversity and livelihoods that go along with it. So this time the headlines came through crystal clear, and we were very happy with the reports, but we were even more happy with the response from scientists. The scientific community were fundamentally behind these points, highlighting that this provides clarity and confidence around the role of forests, that the messages were foundational and correct, but even our harshest critic, the harshest critic from 2019 summarized the work of 400 scientists over 3 years as reasonable, which was as good a feedback as I was ever hoping to get. I'll take that to the bank any day. But it wasn't just this scientific consensus. This was actually what built the platform on which the policymakers could move forward. And this formed the basis for a lot of the negotiations that were happening around the EU restoration law. I was contacted by colleagues in Brussels who told me that it wasn't the numbers that mattered, it was the scale of the consensus building that helped them have a platform to move forward with their negotiations and conversations. But this is what brings us, unfortunately, to an even deeper challenge underpinning this movement. And that is ultimately that this EU restoration law, like many nature-based nature policies, was met by people marching in the streets, marching against the new nature protection laws. And they're marching because they're scared. These marches are understandable. People are concerned that nature comes at the expense of their jobs, their livelihoods, their very food security. This idea of a trade-off between people and nature is fundamental in our society. It spreads across our entire globe. People think that nature comes at the expense of farmland, at the expense of jobs and food security. And this is a misconception that has actually undermined various previous civilizations before us. In each case, the massive scale loss of nature leads to ecological collapse, followed by economic collapse and societal collapse. But we are the first civilization that has access to the data that can help us to dodge that. Because we know fundamentally that this is not a linear trade-off. This is not a simple linear relationship between people and nature. Theoretically, we assumed it was actually something more like this. So that if you take an average forested country, as you move along an axis, of course you need to remove some forest in order to make room for agriculture. But once you go beyond a certain threshold, once you've got almost no forest left, then every hectare you remove is only going to deplete your yields. As you lose soil fertility, productivity, you lose the pollinators and all the services that nature provides. Which means there's a tipping point in between, a limit across which we should not tread. And for the first time in my entire academic career, we were delighted and astonished, well not delighted, astonished to realize that the data almost matched the theory perfectly. But what we were more surprised about is where that limit existed. On the average forested country on our planet, when you move beyond a 48% forest loss, that is when you start to get depleting agricultural yields. As you make more space for agriculture, the agricultural yields at a national scale start to fall, which means that in many cases, increasing nature protection is necessary for improving your agricultural yields. And we can see where every country on the globe exists on that scale. So many countries, well, some countries still exist in the blue zone, but most countries, about 70% of the countries, are in the red zone. So every hectare of forest they remove, they're losing agricultural yields. And unfortunately, many of the global south countries are right at that tipping point, just at the danger zone before they fall into a more dangerous state. This is the kind of information, the quantitative insights that we can now deliver to policymakers to say exactly how much more nature they need to maximize their agricultural outputs and their economic security. But the next question then is, how do you achieve that? Of course, we need to be protecting everything that we possibly can, but we also need to restore what possibly can be restored. And restoration doesn't just mean planting loads of trees. What it means is removing the limitations to ecological recovery. Those limitations involve the microbes, and we realize that actually, across the globe, when you reintroduce healthy microbes into a soil before reintroducing the plants, recovery rates are increased by an average of 64%. The same is true for animals. These are the vectors of spores, nutrients, seeds. These are the organisms that make these ecosystems come alive. And when animals are allowed to move through interconnected landscapes, recovery is about 38% faster on average, particularly in the tropical regions. But by far the most critical component of these ecosystems and these landscapes is, of course, us, the people. Because the single biggest driver of degradation on our planet is actually economic inequality. We have a very inequitable, massive inequity in the distribution of wealth on our planet, with some of us having massive environmental footprints and then billions of people trapped in an economy that provides them no non-extractive alternatives. This is famously known as the poverty trap. These are rural communities trapped into an economic situation that provides them no alternatives other than to exploit the land around them. And this can involve slash and burn forestry, it can involve excessive fertilizers, whatever the practice is. If you're forced to, if you're provided with no alternatives, this is only going to deplete the ecosystems further, driving further poverty. And this is a feedback loop that can be absolutely devastating. Now when we talk about global restoration, we must be clear that it is not just about planting trees everywhere. Global restoration means finding and connecting the massive, massive networks of people across the globe, the nature stewards on our planet, so that we can allow the flow of wealth to be distributed towards these land stewards, so that they can turn these vicious cycles into virtuous ones, where ecological restoration can improve livelihoods that then further incentivize further ecological recovery. This is how sustainable and regenerative solutions are able to bring back livelihoods at the same time as bringing back biodiversity to landscapes. And this was the mission of an organization that was connected by all of those scientists that I mentioned in that previous video. This is a platform we developed a few years ago called Restor that allows you to draw around any location on the planet and you get free ecological insights, whether it's your farm, your garden, your protected area of a rainforest. And I'll give you a couple of examples. This is a farmer that I'm a big fan of in Ethiopia. You can see the huge footprint of coffee production in the area around as extractive coffee production is very common in the region. But as you zoom into this farm, you can see that that's not the way it looks, because this farm is in an almost intact state. Because what they do is they plant the trees underneath the canopy of an intact forest. This is shade-grown coffee, a very common and in fact growing practice across the region, where the forest traps water and nutrients, so these trees grow without the need for fertilizers and irrigation, which means that coffee production in this farm is actually more efficient and more effective and saves money and makes more money than the coffee production in the nearby area. And it's for that reason that all the farmers in the nearby region are allowing trees to regrow on their farms so that they can have more effective coffee production. Now on Restor, Desta gains free information about the species that grow there. He gets tracking of his carbon and his water dynamics. But most importantly, what he gets is visibility to his customers. Now when you go into his shop, you can see exactly where you're getting your coffee from. You can see that you're not only avoiding a negative footprint, you're actually having a positive environmental footprint with every single coffee you choose. And since that, he's told me that his profits have gone up by 340% since he became visible and transparent, so that he became available to the marketplace. And now with hundreds of thousands of projects like this, farmers, indigenous practitioners, communities all across the globe, all becoming visible in a highly connected global market space, we have the foundation for a movement that can really build. And if once companies and governments start engaging with this process, it's only going to add fuel to this growth. And when individuals like us can start buying their products and visiting their ecotourism sites, then the flow of wealth can start to be distributed towards these projects to build a global restoration movement. Right now, the projects across this platform span over 160 million hectares. That's about 16% of that global goal that was set by the UN as underpinned by all that global scale science. And for the first time, my PhD student just a couple of weeks ago sent me the first insights about the state of ecological recovery across this 160 million hectares of land. This is the most preliminary evidence I've ever put into a slide, but I was so excited about it, I had to include it in the Global Commons Forum. Because across 160 million hectares, there is, of course, many projects that are really struggling, many projects that are failing. But on average, we see a gradual incremental increase after the point of intervention, whether it's conservation, restoration, agroforestry. Collectively, this global movement is increasing with a rate of about 2% of vegetation recovery each year. And this is just the start, the sort of embers of the basis of a global restoration movement that's fully transparent. And now that we can build portfolios like this, now we can start finally to track governmental progress, the progress of individual countries across the globe. You can now click and you can see how every single country in the world is doing towards their CBD targets. And what's exciting is my favorite story is the story of Costa Rica. Many of you will probably be familiar about their incredible Payment for Ecosystem Service program. About 30 years ago, like many of the countries in Central America, they were experiencing huge deforestation rates. But instead of allowing that to progress, they distributed wealth to local farmers to compensate them for bringing back nature on their land. And this did incredible things for the tree cover and the carbon storage, and this has been very well documented over the last 30 years. But what we didn't know is whether that was bringing back ecological integrity or if they were instead just monocultures of trees being planted. And it was not until they became fully transparent across the Restor network that we could now identify those locations and we could send people out to go listening to the soundscapes of nature. I wonder, is it possible to put the sound on just so you could hear the bird sounds? Because but no worries. Oh, it's gone. Sorry, Sorry, I shouldn't have pushed my luck. It's not essential to have the music. It's all right, I can sing the bird sound for you. Let's see if it's... Oh, here we go. There we go, beautiful, thank you so much. So yes, this is what we had students across the country of Costa Rica going to all of these individual payment for ecosystem service sites. Now we know exactly where they are. We can record the soundscapes that are happening in those ecosystems. And what you're hearing is the soundscape of one of the average soundscape of a farm across the region. And in fact, this is the average soundscape of an intact, untouched natural rainforest, one that was never cut down even 30 years ago, one that has remained ever since. You can hear the incredible diversity of sounds. But unfortunately, around 30 years ago, the average soundscape of the country would have been closer to this, the sort of static soundscape of a degraded pasture. This is the average, what you can see here plotted in the yellow is the average soundscape of a degraded pasture across the country. But what's amazing, after 30 years of this payment for ecosystem service program, across thousands and thousands of those farms, the average soundscape now sounds closer to this. This is the soundscape that has been restored within 30 years. It's gone from the yellow line almost all the way to that green line. In fact, it's about 68%, 86% on average of the way to recovering that full, highly diverse, complex soundscape that you hear. And what we hear in the background is not just birds and bees and insects, it's also howler monkeys. You don't get large-bodied organisms like that unless you've got all the nutrients and resources that are necessary to keep such large bodies alive. And that means there's true, intact ecological recovery happening across massive scales. And what's even more exciting is we correlated these soundscapes with the sound of music. If we downloaded the 100,000 most frequently downloaded songs of all time, and they sounded statistically closer to this than they did to this. Now I know that sounds very happy-clappy, but in all honesty, this is baked deep into our evolutionary history. We've evolved in ecosystems where the high and low frequency soundscapes indicate the availability of foods and nutrients and all the things that we need to sustain our large bodies. And so it's no surprise that our musicians across time have tapped into those deep evolutionary preferences to build musical frequencies, musical soundscapes out of the preferences that we have deeply baked into our evolutionary preferences. But obviously the coolest thing about the Costa Rica story is that it happened at a time of economic growth for the country, proving that just like Destas and all those thousands of other projects around the Restor platform, that nature can be the economic choice, but at a national scale. As nature got baked more and more into the cultural identity, so the economy started to grow and thrive. This collaboration was made possible because of a grant from Prince William's Earthshot Prize, and they're now encouraging governments and companies to do exactly the same thing, because global restoration is not an environmental challenge, it's a societal challenge. We need to be democratizing access to wealth so that we can distribute the flow of wealth to the hundreds of thousands, to the millions of local landowners, the farmers, the indigenous populations, so that they can find the regenerative and sustainable solutions that can bring back nature on our planet. So the solution to our environmental challenge is already here among this community. Thank you very much.
All right, we are still hunting for another scientist, Bob Watson. And while waiting for him, I just want to introduce what kind of message he would like to send. Bob Watson is a very famous and world-renowned scientist, natural scientist. And he was the former chair of IPCC, former chair of IPBES. But to me, my personal connection with him is he's the first inaugurating the director for the STAP, it's a Science Technology Advisory Panel for the GEF. That I served the GEF for 8 years, and that's how I came to know him personally. But what he wanted to say, I still hope that he can come in at some point, but what he really wanted to say is he observed this where we are in this environmental crisis, and he was extremely clear it's man-made crisis, and we were totally out of balance with the planetary system. And unfortunately, he said that all those environmental treaties which he kind of associated with, completely failed to meet that obligation. And not only environmental treaties, but the SDGs is also that we are not able to meet their original goal. So how we can really solve this challenge? His point is that we need a total, radical system transformation. That's the only way for us to kind of survive in this environmental emergency. But he said very interesting thing, that he said that the system change, economic and financial system change, really needs to spearhead to make this transformation happen. And that's where I think that I would like to invite Dominic Waughray as a kind of thought leaders, that in that space, that Dominic has been World Economic Forum Managing Director, and now he's the Executive Vice President of WBCSD. He's at this interface of the policy, the political, economics, and the finance. He knows this world quite well. So how you could really answer to this question? So Dominic, come to the stage and give us a good response and to us.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go here, is that right? Okay, hello everyone. Well done, Tom, brilliant. I don't have any kind of musical kind of symmetries or rainforests. In fact, this might be a bit of a rainy day story, but if we can go from the amazing kind of presentation that Tom just gave and the beauty of the ecosystems to kind of how are we going to get this to work in our economic system, and in particular with the business community. That's the little bit that I just want to share with you. I know there's great work going on, and we've got some amazing colleagues here who've been looking at what we call nature on the balance sheet with capital markets and things like that. But in between the ecosystems that, Tom, you talked about, and the capital markets that perhaps we're looking at, there is this slightly awkward piece, which is large businesses and what they do or don't do. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on that. We don't need to talk more about these things, but it's always useful to put this up because there are so many kind of documents, reports, initiatives that tell us how much of an emergency we have in climate, nature, and the mounting inequality. You can find the statistics at your will, but there's plenty of them. We also have an awful lot of literature which tells us that there's an urgency to act, whether it's from organizations of science like IPBES, the Planetary Boundaries, or other initiatives that try to put these into practice. So we know there's an awful lot of literature out there which says we have to do something pretty quickly. And for those of you in the university, I'm sure you study this an awful lot. The last time I talked about this, and Michael, you mentioned it, we had 6 out of 9 boundaries that weren't quite kind of where we want them to be, and now we have 7, which includes oceans. So, we have a lot of kind of research going on, but perhaps we're not really getting to where we need to get to. And this is the rather worrying thing. So, 2019 saw the emergence of something called the Science-Based Targets for Nature, SBTN. And this is the equivalent of SBTI, which looks at trying to get businesses to have science-based targets to tackle climate. 2019 it was established, that's 6 years ago. When I put this slide up, and I talked about it in May, it was 160 companies in the world which were engaged in SBTN. There's actually now 150 on the website, 17 who are in pilot programs, and 3 who have adopted a validated SBTN. So we're not quite where we want to get to with the program, even though it's a very, very important piece of work, but the pace of adoption is quite low. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And one particular interesting challenge, which is the link, I think, between where the business community is at and where some of the science is at, is how do you turn a science kind of approach, if you like, a landscape, an ecological approach, into something that works for a business? A lot of the time, the scientists will say it's very, very local, it's very specific, it's very landscape specific, and yet a large business has a value chain which touches multiple landscapes all at the same time in many, many different locations, and has a process which goes all the way through the value chain rather than only thinking about a particular place in time. Water is a good example of that. Many of us have been in the water space for some time, and many experts in the water space will talk about water being local and place-based. But water is also an input to a value chain and can kind of travel all the way through a value chain. Think of a tomato, where it's grown and where it's sold, as an example. So there's a challenge between trying to create a science-based target based on what ecologists might think, and a science-based target which has a business process attached to it, where a company might be at. And that's a little bit of a conundrum to turn this amazing science into action. And in a way, one of the challenges is the phrase, decision useful data. How can I turn all that amazing science into data that I can use as a business? And that's really the conundrum that we face right now. The other truism is that the world will hold somebody accountable for this challenge, and that will probably be large businesses. You saw me put up some great kind of newspaper headlines and such. And there's a couple of initiatives which are doing quite well, actually. The TNFD, and we've got a representative here, I think, from Japan's TNFD. So 25% of the world's globally systemically important banks with a lot of money, $18 trillion in assets, commit to align with these TNFD recommendations. And importantly, in April 2025, TNFD formalized a collaboration with something called the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. It's a lot of acronyms, but they're quite important pieces of the jigsaw, to integrate its recommendations into a global sustainability reporting standard. Why that's important is because if you're a big business, then actually having a kind of set of standards which everyone follows starts to make sense. The ISSB is a super important piece of the jigsaw for sustainability reporting. You can see some words there. So it's over 30 jurisdictions and over 50% of the global GDP and over 40% of the global market cap are kind of in the mix for the ISSB standards, and China, importantly, is committing to that in 2027. So we have a kind of framework which is taking shape a little bit at the global level to allow for disclosures around nature-related activities for business, linked to the most important sustainability framework that there is globally. And we have a target system which is trying to get off the ground and get mainstreamed, but importantly, it exists. But to get to where we need to get to, in terms of kind of companies, they need a couple of things. So this is what I've kind of learned on this little journey of working with many businesses over a long time. So first of all, they need to have performance management systems. So a company needs to integrate its risks and opportunities related to nature. What are my dependencies? What are the impacts I have? How do I turn that into an internal performance management system so that I can create decision-useful information to prepare myself against risks and kind of provide performance information to those who might be interested in it. Perhaps they're in the financial markets and they might use that information in their valuation model for me, and that will in turn promote some interest from those who've got capital. And hopefully, if I'm doing the right things and I'm moving on my nature-related activities in a positive direction, the capital markets will give me a lower cost of capital. Ironically, it doesn't quite work like that, which is the real challenge, which is why the nature on the balance sheet work is so important. I'll give you a real-time example. So there is a large drinks beverage manufacturer, quite well known. It has earnings before income tax, depreciation, and amortization. That means the money it creates in its last and latest kind of 12-month trail is about $6 billion. So it's a reasonably sized company, makes drinks, needs a lot of water, needs a lot of barley, does all of this. It's run its assessments on its performance management, and it reckons that by 2035, unless there's substantial investment in its activities, that EBI DT will basically disappear. It will not have $6 billion of earnings before income, depreciation, tax, and amortization. So it goes in 10 years. And yet, if it tries to put that investment program to its investors, to its shareholders, for example, on an investor day, it's seen as a cost. And so its value goes down as a company. It's not seen as an investment. This is a challenge that this company is in right now. So even though we have all of the information from the nature side and we have kind of real-time dynamic data, we are stuck in terms of how to translate that for a company in terms of investing to do the right thing. And that's a real prickly problem right now, as opposed to 10 years away or 20 years away. And how do we get around that? So when we look at the climate angle and carbon, there has been some work that has kind of almost joined up some of these dots. We know about the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which can help set targets for climate performance for companies. We know that there's a whole set of reporting and disclosure frameworks, and we know that there is a kind of piece of the jigsaw called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which provides a universal and commonly used accounting methodology to figure out how I am managing my carbon footprint in Scope 1, within my own operation, Scope 2 for the energy that I use, and Scope 3 all along the value chain. And everybody understands it, so the targets are set on that basis, and the disclosure is based on that accounting mechanism, and even transition plans are based around it. The challenge is that we do not have that piece of the jigsaw for nature, so we have a kind of space that the companies have to try and figure out between looking at dependencies and impacts, looking at targets and looking at disclosure. There's no common framework in between to show your homework. What am I doing and how can you measure me with somebody else to even influence the capital markets? This is the kind of sort of ecosystem in the climate space which a company has to navigate. It's pretty complicated. There's lots of different outfits looking at disclosure and target setting and different kinds of carbon markets and different kind of climate rating. But the one thing that provides a foundational in this busy ecosystem is a common carbon accounting mechanism, in this case the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which has been around for 22 years and is co-hosted by the WBCSD and the World Resources Institute. But if you take away that building block at the bottom, everything else is kind of floating around and doesn't have an anchor. And it seems, from all the feedback that we get at WBCSD, that that anchor is missing in the nature space at the moment. We kind of manage about 60, 70 international companies who look at this, and it's a common kind of feedback, like how do I commonly and universally measure my kind of footprint on nature so that I can understand if I'm meeting a target and the capital markets can understand if I'm doing the right thing. So if you take that equivalent, then here we go with a sort of nature-related version of that. It's pretty similar, and that's the important thing because companies quite like the, a pretty similar approach to things rather than a new idea every time. So you can integrate risks and opportunities. Remember we talked about that. We have nature-positive roadmaps. You can see the Earth Commission science and the boundaries coming in, kind of science-informed nature-positive targets. I'm going, if you like, clockwise from midday, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. You can get your strategy and your transition plan. Importantly, that really should be an integrated plan. We shouldn't be having a separate climate and nature plan, and indeed a social dimension to that as well. Otherwise, it all gets very complicated. So there's a little challenge there for those who work on transition plans. But you can create your transition plan and then look at the big red box, which is probably about 7 or 8 o'clock if you look at this as a clock face. In there, a Greenhouse Gas Protocol equivalent for nature that would provide equivalence on corporate inventory standards and guidance. It could allow you to kind of measure and manage performance, both in terms of your inventory, like carbon does with Scope 1, 2, 3, but also your intervention, which is a fast-moving piece of the accounting framework, which is what am I going to do over the next 10 years compared to business as usual, which the capital markets really like. And also at the product level, not just at the corporate level, which is another big thing that is going on in corporate carbon accounting, so that I measure a product as it goes along a value chain and not just a business. You can do all the same for nature. And if you had that, then you start to kind of be able to work for the business community with equivalents. Your Scope 1 equivalent could be specifically place-based. You could have business unit impacts. We could use some of the geospatial monitoring that you were talking about, Tom. You could have something related to Scope 2. Scope 2 for climate is about the energy you might draw in, but imagine placing your business unit in the context of a landscape, so that there's multiple business units within a hinterland or a watershed or even a jurisdiction. This is the jurisdictional approach, Nico, that many of the global commons discussions have been about. And then there is a value chain equivalent, which is that piece about working all the way along the value chain, and the nature footprint, if you like, kind of all along it. Would obviously need good governance, as we all do for all of these kinds of things, but it's perfectly possible to start thinking about an instrument that could be an equivalent for nature as the greenhouse gas protocol is for carbon, irrespective of the fungibility of carbon and the specificity of nature, which gives us 10 steps. And so here's a recipe for the discussion. So number 8, you can see, is a bit of a theme, I think, of the meeting, nature on the balance sheet. Number 1, Tom, you were kind of referring to it in terms of, science and the absolute recognition of the physical risks that we're getting. But you need to kind of then help a business figure out its dependencies and its impact. You need a roadmap. Then you need your science-based targets, which we already have, but haven't really taken kind of mainstream shape yet. Then you need your protocol equivalent for nature. Then that gives you the disclosure frameworks. Then that helps businesses develop an integrated transition plan. That gets you to the capital market piece, because there's something to get your teeth into from the capital market side. And that gives you then the opportunity for nature on the balance sheet, which should give you then the cheaper cost of capital underpinned by the kind of government or international community or the development finance institutions promoting, enabling policy. So that's the kind of system approach that a lot of businesses are looking for, but there's big gaps in there at the moment. For example, number 4, for example, number 8. And so this is where, if we can fix some of these pieces, we can get to that mainstreaming that will help us get to the place where, Tom, you're saying we absolutely need to be in terms of some of that science. So that's hopefully a little bit of a provocation to stimulate the debate. And if I've got my traduction right, I would like to say arigato gozaimasu. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom and Dominic. And you really crystallized the challenge we are facing, even if the both sides, that the business side and the scientist side, actually look for the similar or shared goal. Still, there is a gap to close. So, and today at the forum, we try to kind of find a way to how to close that gap for the all 5 sessions, but then I don't necessarily need you to answer in at this opening. But if, Tom, for instance, what you need from the business side to come close to your dream, and Dominic, what you need from science side to close that gap. I think you don't have to have all 10 steps, but I just want to be very clear that what kind of gap we want to close. So,
I wonder if our answer is going to be the same. For what I feel like we desperately want and need is for all the businesses to agree on, or I guess I don't know if it comes from the science or comes from the business, but we need to have an agreement on a set of measurements, a set of tools, a set of indicators that can be universally used for everyone. If you're all reporting with apples to apples, you all have the same standardized information that you're all reporting on, we then have the basis for a movement. What's worrying is, at least in the biodiversity space, in the nature space, everybody's measuring something different, everyone's reporting on something different, and it's chaos. It's, you know, that we're all everyone's specializing for some individual aspect of nature, and nature isn't a single aspect. Nature is the complexity of the whole, and I think there needs to be from one side or the other, there needs to be some alignment on what that individual set of metrics is.
Yeah, it's pretty, I would say the same. It's like the 80-20 rule. If we can get 80% of the way there, then that's pretty good considering the urgency of the challenge. That slide I put up, which is the carbon one, that kind of set of cottage industries, if you can coin a phrase, which includes, you know, aspects of the things that we've both worked on over the years, illustrates the complexity. And people love to argue over the head of a pin on something where there's this big challenge that like isn't getting fixed. We're managing to kind of put a thread through that on the carbon side. I think that there's a level of, if I can say, maturity that will be required on the biodiversity nature side, where you can build that into maybe 5 key tracks, whether it's water, some kind of biodiversity measure or forest cover or something, which would allow that kind of protocol to work, which is good enough, at least like, you know, for the next 5 years or 10 years. And then people will get going. Because at the moment, there's just no value proposition for a business to kind of lean in. It's mostly voluntary at the moment.
Thank you so much. I think that for the whole day, we have the whole day to really work on that. So but thank you so much for set the scene beautifully for the entire day. So can you? Thank you so much. Now, Tom, you are released. Dominic, you stay.